You can see that the influence of malthus is pretty great still in the thinking about development. We were told when the Green Revolution happened back in the 40s that the reason there was hunger is because the food population was growing and food production was not catching up, and therefore we needed to break that gap and bring technologies from the north. And well, we have 1 billion people hungry. What happened? And then now we're hearing that population growth goes along with climate change, when it turns out that the responsible for climate change are countries that are underpopulated. United States, Europe are the ones that have caused the climate change historically. There's an ecological debt. And the countries that are mostly populated didn't have anything to do. One peasant in Latin America produces 1 ton of CO2 per year, and one of us here produces 20 or 12. Anyway, I wasn't supposed to talk about that. We have about 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture in the world, and 80% of that is monocultures that are not producing food, actually. There are some of them are producing food, but most of them is producing biomass, basically just for biofuels, but also for cattle that the hungry people don't eat. And there's a huge externalities associated with this model of agriculture, all the way from biodiversity loss, human health costs, soil losses, air emissions, and so on. As a matter of fact, there's quantification here in the United States that just the public health impacts of pesticide use in agriculture is about $787 million, which is something that is not internalized in the economic analysis when we do analysis of agriculture. And then on top of that, although we could be feeding ourselves with 2,000 or 3,000 varieties of crops, we're actually using a handful of them. And here you can see here in the United States how from the 1900s, early 1900s, the tremendous diversity of varieties that we had has actually decreased considerably. And we have landscapes of agriculture now in the United States and other parts of the world where we're exporting our model that are dominated by 2 or 3 varieties. Why is that important? Because those systems are highly vulnerable, not only to diseases, what happened in 1970 with corn that was decimated by diseases because of the genetic homogeneity, but also because they are highly susceptible to climate change. Actually, the systems that are most susceptible to climate change are the genetically homogeneous monocultures that the Green Revolution produced. And here in last year, we lost 30% of the yield of corn just in the United States. And most of that corn actually is transgenic. And on top of that, this agriculture produces 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's kind of a suicidal actually because you are vulnerable, but then you're producing the gases that actually makes you sick. So it's kind of interesting. And then it was very inspiring to me to hear all the doctors this morning talking about, the MDs, talking about, that this is what we need to be eating. Vegetables, fruits, grains, from local diets, from local knowledge. But look at how our agriculture is subsidized. We are producing the food that we don't need. Why would that happen? Well, it turns out that 65% of the subsidies go to 10% of the largest corporate farmers in this country, which actually lobby in Washington and create the farm bill that basically perpetuates that model of agriculture that you guys are criticizing, that are causing obesity, that is causing all that. Then we're exporting our model, that is based on meat, and we don't have the water to actually maintain that type of diet in India or in China, where people are starting to eat more and more meat. Because of obvious reasons. We need 15 liters of water to produce 1 kilo of beef. So these monocultures that are starting to dominate the landscapes of the world, which are not solving hunger, but actually creating hunger, are also part of what Michael Pollan calls the cornification of America, where we're consuming, the high fructose corn syrup in pharmacological quantities that higher than ever, causing all the problems that you guys were discussing. But really, they are not interested in producing food, these corporations, which dominate the landscapes of the world. They're interested in producing biomass. So here you can see the huge increases of biofuels that are going on throughout the world, and replacing some of the tropical systems or the native systems that you were talking about with oil plantations and so on, creating huge impacts ecologically, and culturally and socially and so on. Actually, when we fill our cars here in this country, not too far from now, with 25 gallons of ethanol, and you feel that you're being very ecological, you're eating all the corn necessary to feed one person per year. So really, who's feeding the world today? If these guys are producing biomass, are the peasants. 50% of the food that we eat in the world comes from small farmers. Actually, if you go to Latin America, it's about 80% of the food. These people that have been interacting with the environment for centuries, we have nothing to teach them, actually. If we leave their systems alone, they have shown that there are modes of sustainability, of self-sufficiency, of resilience. There's about 1.5 billion peasant farms and 380 million small farms. Many of them are indigenous peoples. And they have 1.9 million crop varieties in their hands and about 7,616 animal breeds. So yes, you can grow corn at 0 degrees. You go up in the Andes at 3,000 meters, you're going to find corn like that. There's 3,000 varieties of corn. So you can find corns that can grow on different regimes of water, different regimes of temperature. So when you drink your coffee that we were drinking today, it comes out from these systems. This is called the cafetal. But the cafetal is a forest that has 350 useful plant species for food and medicinal purposes, 200 bird species, well, microbes, who knows how many, and insects and so on and so on. So these farmers, nobody from Harvard, from Berkeley, from Cornell came and taught them how to use these systems. You know, they have their own cosmovision, their own ethnoscience, as Tom was talking about, and they're managing 250 species. You know, the most diversified organic farmer that I know here in California manages maybe 20 species. Try to manage 250 species together and then get all that production of food, of medicine, of honey, of you name it, and ecological services. But what are we telling these people? No, you need to modernize. Why? Because you're going to increase production of coffee, because the global markets want coffee. So when you simplify these systems, basically you get rid of all the biodiversity, all the knowledge, and the systems become dependent on external inputs, because now in this system they don't require fertilizers or pesticides or water or anything. And actually when you simplify them so much, like these systems that you take away their shade, which is a habitat for all kinds of organisms, and at the same time they fertilize the system and so on, basically as Lynn demonstrated, you increase their susceptibility to drought, because basically you can see the huge evapotranspiration that happens in those systems when you take away the shade. So the question is, yes, they are more productive when they are monoculture, but what happens when the drought comes? And the drought will come. So farmers in Mexico and many communities in Latin America and Africa and Asia have multiple use systems. Not only they have the coffee system, they have the milpa, they have the acahual, they have their backyard systems. You know, they're managing systems that are self-sufficient. They're producing all kinds of food and medicine and so on. And a lot of research has shown that this functional biodiversity in the systems is correlated with high levels of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, like everybody else was showing before. So what are we going to go and tell them, you know, from here to these people? The only thing I can tell them, don't modernize. Forget about what they are telling you from CIMMYT or from CIAT or from Gates Foundation or who name it. Well, let's go to a country that lost it all. In 1989, in Cuba, 80% of the inputs of fertilizers and petroleum and pesticides went down. Can you imagine that tomorrow in California we turn off the gas, the petroleum imports and the fertilizer and the pesticide? What would happen? The whole thing collapses. Well, in Cuba, there was a little bit of a shake-up, but you can see these were the contribution of small farmers before the special period in different crops. Because before that, they had an industrial agriculture based on the Soviet subsidies. When the crisis came, the peasants were the ones producing the food. Without fertilizer, without pesticides, okay? And they produce 80% of the food at that island, organically. Like this one. For example, this is Casimiro and his wife. I know them very well, this family. I know very well this farm. This farm has 10 hectares. This farm has many characteristics that we want to imitate in this country. And many, many countries, and not only to feed ourselves, but also to become resilient. I'm going to explain why. First of all, you can see the amount of people that can be fed with the production of protein when 1 hectare, 34 persons can be fed with protein. because he has an integration of animals. With an energy efficiency of 30, that means he puts 1 kilocalorie and he gets 30 kilocalories back. You know what's the efficiency of industrial agriculture in the United States? 1.5. This guy is 20 times more energy efficient. That is sovereign. Is sovereign technologically and energetically and food sovereign, okay? Because he doesn't buy anything from the outside. And on top of that, when the hurricanes came, which in Cuba there were 3 in 2008, his farm and many other farms like with this characteristic resisted. Because we have, you can see here the average, for example, in Santi Spiritu, 73% damage, and the more diversified farms, only 60%, 3 hurricanes. But resilience has 2 characteristics. One of them is resistant to the shock, and the other one is recovery. And you can see the productivity of his farm going up, the much more recovery of the productivity 60 days, 120 days after the event. So we can learn a lot about resilience from small farmers. In Central America, when the Mitch came, there was a study done by Erich Jimenez using the Campesino network, and he found that all the farmers that modernized because USAID told them to produce non-traditional export crops for export in the United States, look at what happened with those farms when the hurricane comes. That's the main loss that happens when you have these heavy events, heavy rainfall events, is mudslides. And about 1 block from there, you can find this farm that didn't suffer any damage because it had soil cover, agroforestry systems, all the techniques that farmers traditionally have been using. So you can see there's a huge difference in the amount of derrumbes or mudslides in Honduras, where the hurricane was the worst. In the ecological farms, much less loss than in the monocultures. So we're finding that the agro-ecosystem resilience is associated with the vegetational diversity. The more diverse the systems, the more resilient they are. This is very important for when you have drought, the things that you were talking about. Soil organic matter content, varieties that are resistant to that, and farmers have 1.9 million varieties to select from. Soil cover, water harvesting, are those all techniques that are important but are embedded culturally, because it comes, you need to have the social organization, you have to have the cultural diversity and the knowledge on how to do this. This is not something that is transmitted in journals like we learn in the West. This is all oral traditions embedded in a cosmovision. So just to finalize, we have hunger because we have food empires that are controlling the food system. And part of the control was told this morning, all the propaganda, the money that they spend on propaganda so that they keep pushing, the food that is bad for us. But basically, they also control what the farmers are going to produce, how much they're going to produce, and for whom they're going to produce, and how they're going to produce, and also what we eat, how much you pay, what the quality of the food. These are the Walmarts. These are the Monsantos, and the Walmarts are all the same. And basically, this food system that is controlled by these corporations, the social movements like Via Campesina and many other movements that are very, very powerful at the grassroots level are trying to change it. But at the same time, they're creating what they call a bypass to the corporate food system. And here in this country would be the food justice movement with the urban agriculture initiatives and all these things that Lorian was talking about. But in Latin America is, for example, the control of land, the autonomous territories, like the MST in Brazil. The land species movement in Brazil controls 10 million hectares. They took it. They're not joking. They're not kidding. Their livelihoods are at stake. And they create autonomous territories in which they create local markets that are solidarious with the consumers, and then they bypass the system. That's what we need to do, is create a bypass with all this information that is being given by the medical doctors here and so on. To do what? To create a food sovereignty agenda, which is the people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. That's very easy to say, but how do you do it? Well, in order to do it, you have to have land reform. You see, if the peasants are producing 50% of the food that we eat today on 20% of the land, what would happen if we give them 50% of the land? Well, if you give them 50% of the land, you have to do land reform. And you have to have the social movements that are going to be pushing for the agenda, the agroecological strategies, and the state support. That's very important. For example, in Brazil, although there is a huge advance of soybean, transgenic soybean, and biofuels, they created a Ministry of Rural Development for the small farmers. They have 4.8 million family farmers that produce 70% of the food. So they know that it's very important to support those farmers. So we need the state support, we need the social movement, we need the agroecological strategies, the knowledge that comes not only from the universities but from the farmers themselves, creating a dialogue of wisdoms, but also we need access to land, to seeds, and to resources by the local farmers. So yes, we can feed the world with peasants, with small farmers, and we can do it in a sovereign way, technologically, energetically, and in a resilient way. That is, by creating systems that are going to be able to withstand climate change. Thank you.